All right. So welcome everyone to this talk on security training. There's a great turnout, so this is just for you guys. So there will be lots of opportunity to make this more custom to you guys. So I'll try to get to the end fairly quickly so that there's time for questions. So if you have any questions about anything that I cover, please feel free to ask them at the end. I'm happy to answer them, and it'll be a part of this so that it'll help other people as well. So let's get started. This is me. My name is Hnatiw. I'm a senior security researcher at Security Compass. Security Compass is a security company that does training as well. So I've been able to pull from a lot of our resources there to get some information for this talk, as well as from my own experience. I've been a software developer. I still am, just kind of more of a hobby. College professor as well. I was a security consultant, system administrator, web developer. Kind of run the gamut as far as IT careers go. So I've got a lot to pull from, and luckily I have a great company to pull from as well, where they've really helped contribute to this as well. So let's move on to what this talk is actually about. Well, first off, this talk is about this person. But not only this person, it is also about this person, and kind of especially this person as well. So to start this off, what do you think, and this is probably an easy answer, just take a look at the title of the talk, but what do you think the biggest security vulnerability in any organization is? The answer to this really is the employees, and this has been something that we've known for ages. Ultimately, the biggest problem in security comes down to the human factor, because humans are vulnerable to a lot of things, namely phishing, social engineering, clicking any links on the internet, sharing trade secrets, and insider threats. Employees are one of the most common ways that people will get into an organization from an attacker's perspective. Whether that's through, the most common vectors are through email, through phishing of some sort, and password guessing. And both those really ultimately come down to the employee themselves and the user. So presently, how do we fix these issues? I think that there's a lot of ways that we can fix this. There are some ways that we address it right now, more common ways that we address it, but this talk is really about teaching you how to address this problem and fix it, because I think it is a problem that can be solved and really to make your organization a lot stronger. So how are these vulnerabilities currently addressed? Well, right now we try to do a lot when it comes to the technical side of things to make it seamless and easy for the employees to not even have to think about security. And so the technical controls include things like antivirus, imaging software, data loss prevention, IPS, firewalls, things like that, where those are more technical solutions to the problem of human security that really, like I said, make it easy for employees to not have to think about it. But the problem with this is, and I'll kind of get to this, but really the problem with this is that if we just have this as the only control, then employees and people are really going to find a way around that, whether intentionally or unintentionally. And I'm sure if anyone in the room is a sysadmin or dealing with the quote-unquote user every day, you've probably seen some of the things that they've done to get around the restrictions that you put on their laptop or on the network. The second way that we address this, and this is the subject of this talk, is employee security training. So this talk really is for people who are looking to implement security training in their organization, as well as people who are implementing it currently and who want to improve that offering. And I also want to address the reason of why this is important and how you know it's effective. So I'll cover these things throughout this talk. So to start, how are employees actually trained on security in the organization? Well, right now, the most common thing that I see, especially in the smaller organizations, is not at all. Really, this is kind of the most common way that it's done, and it's just ineffective. Formal training ends after the first week, and that's usually on-the-job training. So it's job-specific, but not necessarily security-specific, and that's the next point. And it's also not present anywhere in the employee handbook. So employees are usually given a handbook. Here's what you need to know in the organization. Usually covers some checkboxes as far as health rules and health and safety rules, and some basic outlines of what your job is. But security is never really a part of that. And this ultimately makes the security team's job impossible to do. Because like I said, if you have technical controls in place, but employees are not trained on how to use them or what they mean or why security is important, then they're going to find a way around that because it's inconvenient. So the second way that we address employee training for security in an organization is computer-based. So I'll talk a little bit more about computer-based right now. The advantages of that is it's self-paced, so people can go take their own time at this, and everyone learns at different speeds. It's less expensive because it's more sold as a product and not necessarily a service, so it's easily packaged up and sold and distributed. It's easy to collect metrics on this because it is a technical solution, and so you can see how many people have completed it, how far people have gotten into it, and so these metrics often tie back to the business needs, and you can actually get a better idea for the effectiveness of how much has been covered across your organization. And speaking to this point as well, when you have a larger organization, it's hard to scale people. When it comes to instructor-led training, that's harder to scale, but with a computer-based training, it's something that you can just kind of plop in and then send it to as many people as you need across the organization. There are some disadvantages to computer-based training. One is it can lead to poor retention. This is often an issue, not necessarily with the training, the method of being computer-based, but part of it is because it's not, you don't have that interaction. Not everyone learns from sitting behind a computer screen and reading things off. There's no sense of interaction. You don't have someone you can necessarily ask questions to. And that kind of goes to the next point is there's often no support without extra costs. So if you want some kind of customization or you want to ask questions to someone about it, usually that will cost extra. And this I will come back to later why this is important, but you can't, when you get computer-based training, because it is product-based, it's a product essentially, it doesn't really get tied into a specific organization other than maybe having your branding. It doesn't tie back to specific projects that are important to the people that are taking the training. And I'll get to why that is important later. So the third method is instructor-led training. Instructor-led training has a few advantages. One is that it's this interactive environment. So like where we are right now, there's someone at the front speaking about a subject, but in a classroom environment, you have the opportunity to, at any point, if there's any questions, if there's something that you don't quite get, you can raise your hand and you can ask, and you can get the answer immediately. Which is really, really valuable when you're trying to retain information that is new and something that you haven't necessarily learned before, which is very common when you're dealing with training on security. Because most people do not think about or even care about security. So the next point is that you have a better retention because of that. So everyone learns differently, but with instructor-led training, you have the chance to A, tie it back to relevant projects, but B, incorporate all different types of learning methods and teaching methods that makes it so that anybody can learn the subject matter. And it's also more customized, so you can tie it into specific projects. You can tie it into what what the goals of this organization are. So it makes it a lot more relevant to people. And it can be more fun. So you have the opportunity to do more with it, and so you can tweak it and change it and adapt it based on the audience that you have. Some disadvantages to instructor-led training are it's more expensive because you're paying for that customization, you're paying for the expertise and that person to come in. And it's easy to do poorly. As most of you, I'm sure, have experienced throughout your educational career, you've had a teacher that has made you really, really love a subject that you never thought you would love before, but you can also have a teacher that really makes you hate it. This is very common in maths and sciences. Because if it's not taught well, often it leads to people not really enjoying that subject, and they don't care. Like, they really could not care any less about it at the end of the day. So let's take a look at how to actually do training right. So if you're looking at implementing training, or if you do offer training, these kind of tips will help you, and this is something to look for when you're looking to introduce training to your organization. So number one, you should really know your audience. This is really, really key. I like to split the audience into 3 different categories when you're dealing with instructor-led training especially. And that goes down to general staff, management, and the technical operations folks. So these are the 3 categories that I split it into. Obviously, this, can be split up even further, but generally this is the way to address training. You can split the audience into these 3 different categories. So first, let's look at general staff. So this is people who are involved in the day-to-day operations, but they may not necessarily have a technical job in nature. And they may not necessarily be making strategic decisions in the organization. So when you're looking at general staff, what you need to cover is, the main thing you need to cover is security basics. So the basics of security, because a lot of these people aren't coming from a background where they know anything about security because they haven't had to care about it. So some examples of security basics include knowing to forward suspicious emails to IT, and what a suspicious email may look like. Because many people, thanks to really good spam filter we have now, many people don't actually look through their spam filter. They don't know what is spam, what does it actually mean, what does it look like compared to a regular email. So introducing this is really important. Office macros, I'm not going to belabor this point, but it's saddening that this is still a really easy vector into most organizations. A lot of attacks use Office macros and are successful because it essentially allows you to execute code on a machine through a Microsoft Word document. So understanding that you shouldn't really ever need to enable Office macros is a good thing. You can disable it usually across your organization, but having them understand this is really important. This is probably the most important point, is that you should never be solicited for your password. So employees shouldn't just understand this, your grandparents should understand this, your parents, your friends, everyone. No one should ever come to you asking for your password. There is zero reason for that. Anytime you need to change your password or a password is involved, you should be going to that location, to that place that you trust, to change it there. So for example, you will never get an email saying, we need your password, in this box, or go to this form to fill out this password to do something on your account. Instead, if you get that prompt, you should first talk to your IT and just make sure it's legit. But second, you should go to that actual website that you know the website of, so your banking website, for example. You should go to that website and go to your account and change your password there. It should never be the other way around. So this applies to phone, email, carrier pigeon, whatever. There should be never any reason where someone's going to solicit you for your password. So make sure they know this. This is probably the most important point. And really, when it comes down to it, when in doubt, report to IT or security, depending on your organization's structure. So there should be an understanding and a part of the culture that it's okay to send this, to ask questions to IT. It's okay to send, these emails that you're not sure about to IT, because our job in security and IT in general is to help educate users. As much as we don't like to deal with users, you will be doing everyone a favor if you can educate them. And so having a discussion about something, sharing your knowledge, is a way to make it so that the next time they have a question around this, if you've already taught them the basics and things they need to know, they won't bother you, because they'll likely know the answer. Maybe it'll take 2 or 3 times, but our job is to make it so that everyone is more aware of this. So when in doubt, report to IT should be something they should know as well. And this is something that's particularly relevant. Lock your computer. So funny story about this. In our company, at Security Compass, we have a policy. It's just part of our culture that we do this. It probably started with someone making a bad fashion decision, but there's this thing that we do. If someone has their computer unlocked, and someone spots that, they will go up to that computer and they will send an email to the entire company saying something about baggy pants. So I think one day someone came into the office and they had baggy pants on. I guess they thought it was the 90s again. And they left their computer unlocked, and someone sent an email saying, I love baggy pants, to the whole organization. Well, in our company, usually within the first week or two, someone will send out a baggy pants email, but it doesn't happen more than twice. So this is something that's difficult to implement in a bigger organization later on, because people are going to be upset if you send out an email to everyone in the organization, on your behalf and shame you, but it's a part of teaching that in a continuous way, because we understand that if your computer is unlocked, if someone has physical access to your computer, it's game over. I think we all know this. Regardless of if it's a computer, server, workstation, doesn't matter. If someone has physical access to it, especially if there's nothing blocking them from accessing anything, it's game over there. So a really good hot key is on Windows systems is the Windows key and L, instantly locks it. Get in the habit of, before you leave, Windows key L. On the Mac, I think it's Control-Shift-Power, but it changes. Anyways, understand that the importance of locking your computer when you're not using it. And password management, this is a whole other subject on its own, which I'm not going to dive too deep into, but you should have some policy around password management, so users aren't putting it on a sticky note on their screen, so they aren't putting it in a password notebook in their desk drawer, or even just using the same password everywhere. Have some kind of policy around this, and just make sure that they understand what that policy is. Ideally, they should have a different password, a unique, random password for every website they use and every location they have a password. But however you manage that, make sure that they understand that as well. And it really comes back to what your security policies are and the culture around it. So a key thing here is a lot of organizations have a policy where you have to have your badge out and present and visible at all times. However, in most cases I've found this is not really enforced, and I'll tell you a story about that later. So just make sure that they understand these policies and that it's okay to question someone about this. It's okay to ask someone to show you their badge. So make sure they understand the policies you have in place, because they're there for a reason. And a lot of the time, this comes back to that first week when they come into training. if this isn't covered, how can you expect them to enforce that or even really keep any kind of security on their own? So make sure they know the policies that you have in place. So this is the general staff. Moving on to management, they should know the security basics. Security basics is something that I think that everyone should know, especially from the onboarding perspective. But what's really important here for management is phishing and spear phishing awareness. Because oftentimes these people are the decision makers. They can make more highly impactful decisions relating to the business. So financial transactions, for example. So make sure that they understand what phishing and spear phishing looks like. So some examples of what you would teach here is being aware of attachments. So be wary of attachments because oftentimes this is just an easy way to get in. Like for example, you shouldn't ever get a JavaScript attachment that you need to open, right? Same with the Office macros and everything. Again, key point, I cannot belabor this enough. You will never be solicited for your password. Okay, if you are, report it to IT. And I mentioned before financial transfers and how management usually has access to doing things around this. Make sure that you have a policy around it first off, and second, that they know what that policy is. So if you need two people, two different executives to sign off on a transaction, or you need legal, for example, this is very common to have legal sign off on all large transactions, let's say over $10,000. Make sure that they understand this and they know it. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just they just should be aware of that policy to prevent them from accidentally, sending off a large amount of assets to an attacker. And a really important point, when in doubt, report to IT and security, because that's what we're here for. So let's move on to technical operations. I'm going to come back to security basics. They should know this as well. But technical operations is more the people that are, you're looking at developers, system administrators, anyone who has like IT as a part of their job role should really fall into this category. So the basics is important for everyone, but also some platform-specific vulnerabilities and security around specific platforms. So whether that's looking at web development, looking at running Windows systems, running Cisco networking gear, whatever, they should understand specific vulnerabilities and issues to those platforms. So an example of this is OWASP Top 10. Doesn't necessarily cover everything, but it's a good introduction to web security. Secrets management. So understanding not to push an API key to GitHub. Understanding how you actually incorporate secrets, so it's like passwords or API keys, for example, into code, or using it locally, so password management. And you should have, again, all of these things, it's best to have a policy around this, so you have a formalized way and something you can point to and put in the employee handbook that people can reference. So they may not remember all of this the first time around, right? So they need to have a place to go and look at it later on. Another thing is encryption and hashing. This is really important. They should understand when to use one over the other because they're not the same thing, and you should be using them in different cases. This is especially important for developers. Also, not to ever roll your own, salting, and the concept of trust but validate. Trust but validate is something that's kind of important across all of security, but just when it applies to encryption and hashing, this is kind of the important point. So they should understand these things, and also this is not just important for developers, recommended algorithms, but also to people that are managing a network and managing system configuration. Because let's say you're running a web server, you should understand what kind of certificates you're going to accept. You should understand what algorithms you're going to use for SSL or TLS. These are things that are not just applicable to encryption and code, but also encryption and configuration. So having this knowledge around what you have in your as a policy in your organization. For example, are you going to just support TLS 2 and above, or are you going to go back and support TLS 1.0? Understand the risks of what you're doing, but maybe you need to support those older operating systems. So just having some kind of standards around this is important and being able to reference it here. And then input, validation, output, and coding is kind of like the gold standard of what developers should understand, because like every vulnerability comes from malicious input, really, when it comes down to it. So understanding that these are two methods to mitigate any vulnerabilities, really, when it comes to code. And last but not least, they should understand where to learn more, because as we all know, security is a constantly evolving field. There is always more to learn, and you're never going to understand everything. I don't think you'll ever understand everything. But they should have the resources available to them to learn more about security. So, for example, conferences like this, great place to learn new things. There's, Twitter's a really great place. A lot of people that are in, a lot of the speakers and a lot of people that are in security are on there. And this is where they talk about, some of the newest things that are coming out. That's probably where I learn about 99% of the new issues that are coming up on the scene. is through Twitter. There's also, Reddit has rNetSec. HackerOne is a really good platform because it's a bug bounty platform that if you go to their Hnatiw feed, it will actually show you published bug bounty reports that, all the latest ones that are coming out. Not only that, they have, I think they recently came out with a newsletter called Zero Daily, so HackerOne Zero Daily. Really, really valuable. I just recently found this. It's a daily newsletter that has, bug bounty reports and some news from security that's a little more technical than your dark reading, for example. So having a place where developers and technical operations folks can learn more is really important because they're going to have to learn more to keep up. As we all understand, if you don't keep up with security, then you're falling behind. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is really a really important point is how to make it fun. Why do we need to make security training fun? Well, I mean, besides the obvious point that research and common sense show us, but if it's fun, if someone has an interest in a subject, that increases retention, recall, task persistence, and effort. So it actually makes it easier to learn. So the more you care about a subject, the more you enjoy learning it, the more you're going to want to learn, and the faster you're going to learn, the better you're going to learn. So it's really important to do that. But not only that, and this is a really important point that I'm going to reiterate at the end, but please remember this. Your goal, your number one goal in training should not necessarily be the content. It should be sparking an interest in what you're teaching. This is true across any subject. Because if you can spark an interest in what you're teaching, if you can get someone interested even in the littlest tiniest bit in what you're teaching, then that's a seed that will grow on its own. And they will then go out outside of work on their own, and they will start to look into this. This has been my experience in security. I went to school in criminology to be a federal police officer. And then I met a guy who was hacking Wi-Fi, and I was like, you can do that with a computer? And it blew my mind. And from then on, I started just spending all my time researching this because that seed was formed in my brain, that little bit of interest in what this subject was, and then it's grown on its own since then. And I'm sure many of you have had this experience. So if you can plant that seed and spark a little bit of interest in whatever you're teaching, but in this particular case about information security, then that person will then go on and they will start learning on their own. And they will learn way more than you can teach them at any course, any length of time, because they will be interested in it and they will want to carry on their own. So if you're going to remember anything from this talk, remember that. So let's move on. How can you make training fun? Well, one way is to do hands-on hacking demos and labs. This is more geared towards the technical group because they're going to be more interested in the technical side of things. But again, this comes back to knowing your audience. Maybe you have a bunch of management folks who are really into, like, how do hackers do what they do? Like, what is a actual technical attack looks like? I've heard of Mimikatz. How does that work? Things like that. If you know your audience, then this could work for them, but generally it's the technical group that will appreciate this. So one method is, here's a few resources you can look at. WebGoat, Metasploitable, Mutilidae. These are just some resources that are deliberately vulnerable that you can use to learn how to hack, essentially, how to do specific attacks against these platforms. Here's finally a use for those old XP boxes. Put it up and see what you can do to attack it, right? Maybe make it, start it earlier on so it's got even more patches that it doesn't have, and so learn how to attack it. All these things you can set up in a virtual environment. So whether you're using VMware, VirtualBox, it doesn't matter. Set up a little virtual network, and it's really easy and really cheap to just set up a bunch of boxes together to go to town on, basically. A few more resources. Hack This Site is a website you can practice. RaceTheWebUp.io. I wrote this. It's actually a way to test and show what a race condition vulnerability looks like on a web application. So it walks you through it step by step. It's pretty straightforward using a big banking application. Another one is CTF events. So I believe we did have a CTF here, but CTF stands for Capture the Flag. If you're not aware of it, it's basically a giant set of puzzles that you have to solve for flags. When you capture a flag, so when you solve that puzzle, you get a flag submitted, you get points. The team at the end of the day, or the individual with the most points, wins. But the fun part comes in trying to capture those flags, because you learn a ton just by getting to the point where you're trying to figure out, okay, how do I get to that flag? You can learn probably things you will never use in your entire IT career, but the value is it teaches you how to think like an attacker, right? It's more the mindset that is the outcome of this than necessarily the individual knowledge itself. So there's a lot of events you can do. There's a website here called ctftime.org. that shows a bunch of the some upcoming capture the flag events. I think these are all online, but there's one happening regularly, like at least monthly, probably almost weekly. So just check that out, and that'll give you some more there. If you can incorporate this into your training, capture the flag events, there's a bunch of write-ups on existing capture the flag challenges. If you can find those, then you can go through it with your class, and then they can see, like, what does it actually look like to hack into this and to capture this flag. It's really, really fun. I would highly recommend doing those. Second way that you can do it is through theoretical scenarios. So one example is through like tabletop scenarios. So when you sit down with them and you present the scenario of here's a security issue or this happens, how do you deal with it? A key to this is providing minimal detail. If you provide minimal detail, you're not telling them exactly everything they need to know. They will then, it's required that they will ask you probing questions to figure out more. And in doing that, in starting that conversation about understanding that situation a little bit more, they'll start to learn what they need to know when a real situation comes up. So by asking those questions, you have a conversation, and this is the best way to really teach what the important things to learn are. So when you're doing a tabletop scenario, a key thing to remember is providing minimal detail because it forces them to ask clarifying and probing questions. One other thing you can show them is a phishing email versus a real email. I was talking about this before, but some of them are very good, like really, really good. There was, I think, like a month ago or a few weeks ago, there was the giant Google Docs email that was incredibly successful because it looked legit, and they caught hundreds of thousands of people in it through this one phishing email. You can look it up later, but it shows the effectiveness of a really good phishing email. So maybe point to that one and say, does this look like a real email or not? And then look at a real email, does this look like a real email or not? It's a really important thing to kind of start that awareness of what a phishing email actually could look like. Another one is, speaking to developers, actually go through this particular application. What happens if there's a man in the middle? What happens if someone is listening in a connection between the client and the server? Or what happens if this part of the application goes down? What happens if they send like 500 requests to the same endpoint at the same time? Things like this where you'll get them actually thinking about their own application and what different kind of security events could happen. This is where we use our expertise as security professionals to understand what an attacker could do, because oftentimes it won't occur to developers because they don't think about this. So by asking these questions, it starts to get them thinking about what an attacker would actually do. As a side note, when I do threat modeling and when I go into an organization to help with threat modeling, the most fun thing to do, and my favorite part about it, is when I start asking these questions, I don't necessarily point to, okay, here, this is an issue, this is an issue, this is an issue. I say, if you were an attacker and you wanted to bring this application down, let's say you wanted to find a way to just DOS it off the internet, how would you do it? And then at first they're kind of stunned, like, what? Then then you can see the gears turning and they start to think like, what would I do? And then they get to have fun being deviant, right? And have a little fun trying to break their own application. It forces them to think in that way. And when you can think like an attacker, that's when you can start to learn to think like a defender and properly defend against those attacks. So this is a really fun way to do it. Again, reference real situations where possible. It makes it more real for them, and they can tie it back to existing knowledge. And it's when you're doing this theoretical scenario, kind of what I'm talking about, it's not a full threat model. A threat model is a completely different outcome. A full threat model is there to get a better understanding for what your threats are, what your posture is across your whole organization as far as security goes, and all your applications. This is a one particular question, one particular situation. So it's more, again, the goal is about thinking about security rather than getting a full understanding of your whole organizational security. So let's go into a few other tips. One thing, and this applies to across any content that you're teaching, is changing environments, because no one likes to sit still in one place for hours at a time. No one does. It's not natural. No one likes doing that. So try to change up the environment, whether you go to the server room, whether you go to go outside or go teach in another meeting room, whatever it takes to change environments. It keeps people awake, keeps people paying attention, right? Even something as simple as moving around is way less boring than just kind of standing in one place and preaching. So keep that in mind. And I've referenced this many times already, but specifically tie the material that you're covering. So if you're training in security, or if you're looking for training in security, if you can find a way to tie whatever that material is to existing content or a project they're working on, or their organizational goals, tie it back to something they already know, that reinforces, that helps strengthen the things they learn. Because everything we learn is based, we try to tie it back to existing knowledge. The best way to learn something is to find a link to something you already know. So if you're trying to teach this new concept of security, many people don't have any concept of what security is or why it's important. If you can find a way to tie it back to something they already know, that helps build and strengthen those connections in their mind, and they will have a better chance of remembering it later on. So it's really important to tie it back to something they already know in some way or form. Next up, let's look at timelines. So these are just general timelines about how often you should actually be doing the security training. There's no hard and fast rule. It's different for organizations, but this is probably some best practices to follow. When you're looking at the general staff, it's best to do it during onboarding. So when they're first coming on, don't just do on-the-job training, but also train in security, covering those basics. Test them annually. So make sure that they're not falling off. It's not something they learn once and then forget about. You can test it through, a written exam, through scenarios, some of those theoretical scenarios that I covered before. Try doing those annually or more often. And just doing random audits as well. So doing just random testing throughout the year of like figuring out what do you do in this situation, test them. So an example of this would be a really good way to test this is phishing, doing some phishing campaigns. It's harmless. Ultimately, it will teach them a lesson, and it's really easy to do. So send off a few fake emails to your organization, have fun crafting it, making it look real. See how many people click it. That's your response. Test it regularly, and then you have a metric to measure against. Another thing is red team. I'm going to repeat this for every single one of the groups because, yes, while it's important to teach this material, you don't really understand if it's being implemented or how they're implementing it until you test that, until you try to find out. There's no way you can't understand something until you measure it. So these are different ways of measuring it. Red team is probably the most effective one, but there's a caveat that if your organizational security isn't really up to a certain level, or it doesn't have a good baseline, then red team may be ineffective because they'll probably just run through everything. So there's different levels. Management. Onboarding as well is really important, but also random audits I'm going to come back to again because it's important to assess and measure how effective it is in the organization. So phishing, red team, and this is especially important here to management to do those random audits because oftentimes people in management are bombarded with requests and bombarded with so many things that everyone else thinks is important, which they probably are to those people. But if you have 500 things coming at you at once, how do you measure what is the most important thing versus other things? Well, doing some kind of random audit, doing an actual test of your organizational security and showing where you stand, if it's bad, then that is something quantitative that you can point to say, this is something we need to improve, and here is exactly why, this is the reason, and this shows you that we need to improve it. So when it comes to management, having something you can point to, some kind of metric or some kind of measurement, is really important when it comes to making decisions about security. So moving on to technical operations, onboarding again, training annually. So training is important for technical people because in any technical role, whether that's development, system administration, or security at all, it's important to keep up because it's always evolving. Like I mentioned before, security is constantly changing, always evolving. It's important that they keep up to date with the latest trends. So give them the opportunity to do that and encourage them and really enable them to constantly allow them to be training, whether that's through a training budget, bringing people in-house to train, or to offer some kind of specialty course, whatever it takes. It's important that they keep up to date on their technical skills. And then random audits for the same reasons as I've mentioned before. But one specific one that I'm going to point out that's different from the other random audits is incident response. A lot of technical operations folks have to deal with incident response, and it's not, if you're fortunate, it's not tested regularly. You don't want to have to deal with incidents all the time. However, if you can find a way to simulate it, I'm not saying at 2 a.m. on a Saturday night or something where you're going to ruin your sysadmin's weekend. Nothing like that, but throughout the week or randomly throughout the year, try throwing a mini crisis at them and seeing how they respond. And then if you keep it short and sweet, then it's something that, okay, yes, maybe they had to deal with it and scramble and figure it out, but they learn from it. And they are tested in a way that's not going to damage your whole organization. So when it comes to random audits, a really good thing to keep in mind for the technical operations folks is incident response as well. So let's take a look at how you actually test to see whether they've retained the material, because if you've done your job well, they will retain it, but how do you know this? So a few ways you can do this is is through testing it throughout, test understanding throughout the entire time you're teaching. So instead of sitting at the front of the class or having someone sit at the front and say, this is what you need to know for a week, without any kind of feedback or testing throughout, you may have had someone or everyone stuck on the first day, and by the time you get to the last day, they wouldn't have learned any more than what you taught on the first day because you didn't check in regularly to know that they understand what you're talking about. So it's really important when you're teaching anything, when you have someone coming in to teach, that they're constantly checking in and making sure everyone's on the same page. So you can do this through things like situation-based scenarios to make it a little more fun. You can do written tests as well. Written tests often aren't as effective in testing comprehension, but if you keep it short and keep it maybe more around having like an essay question or something where they need to expand on it, it's a little bit better. But the reason why you can do these written tests and the reason why you should is because it provides more quantifiable data. So it's easy to say, like, they got, this person got 9 out of 10, they roughly are on par with where we're at, as opposed to finding someone who's maybe 1 out of 10 and it's like, okay, this person's probably not keeping up with where we're at. So it's important to have that quantifiable metric as well. And then you can do an exam at the end of the course, however you want to do that. Again, if you can stay away from just doing written stuff, where you can have some kind of conversation or a scenario where you can test them in, that's even better. But there's a bonus if there's a certification tied to it, because not only will that incentivize your employees to want to do it, because having another letter to the alphabet soup at the end of their title is important, but also as an organization, you can then point to these certifications that you have. So you can say, okay, our employees are X and Y and Z. So you can say that these people are all certified, and then you now have more credibility as an organization. And then, again, coming back to regular security audits, the reason I keep talking about this is because it's important to measure the effectiveness. And one of the best ways to measure how it's implemented and how it's being practiced across the organization is these regular security audits. So phishing, social engineering, red team exercises. And then something a little more novel that you may not have thought about is in these regular performance reviews that pretty much everyone does, why not have a little component for security? So just ask them a question about, okay, in this situation, what would you do? And have a conversation. It's best if you have someone there who is maybe a security champion or someone who is a security expert in the organization, or bring someone in, and it's important to have that dialogue because security is more than black and white, as most things are, and there's more than one right answer, and there's usually a more depth involved in solving security problems. So if you can have a conversation around it, it's usually better than just having them answer, what's on port 23, right? How do you, what's a firewall? Something like that. So have a conversation there. So how do you actually know how it's worth it? So do you know whether the training's worth it? When you're trying to sell it to your management, how do you know it's worth it? Problem is this can be a trick question. Because oftentimes if security training is done well, you won't know that it's done well because you'll likely avoid a number of serious security incidents without even being aware of it. This is what you want, but you don't know you want. And management doesn't know they want. But ideally, if you've done it right, then you won't know. So I'm going to give you a few examples of some training, effective training results and ineffective training results right now. So the point of this is more to demonstrate exactly what you get with effective or poor training and really where it can be critical in specific situations that may not have happened to you yet, but one day could happen, and this is how you avoid them. So first off, when I was, so I've done a number of red team assessments, and I love it. One that we did, we were on site at this large organization. This is a big company in this big facility, and we were there. We got in, I won't go into details, but it involved balloons and the security guards and the birthday. But we got in, and we basically hung out in the cafeteria till the nighttime, and then we just, at nighttime, did our thing. But we needed a spot to set up shop, to put our laptops and kind of have our base of operations. So we chose this meeting room that was kind of bottom floor out of the way, or we thought it was out of the way. But it was out of the way, and we kept seeing people go back and forth. We were like, this is more well-trafficked than we thought. When we went outside, we looked at the door next to us. It said Security Operations Center. And there were security guards and security folks always constantly walking back in front of the meeting room, which had a clear window. It was not like a, boarded up room. It was a clear window. And they saw us regularly. And throughout the night, this kind of startled us at first, but later on, as the night went on, we started to realize they're not doing anything. They don't really care. Their policy, so they have this badge policy where everyone had to have their photo ID and their badge present and visible at all times. So we were going through the building, and at first we were trying to kind of avoid the security guards. But after a while, we realized they didn't care, and we would walk by them and just kind of wave by as we went by. And one of us had a fake visitor badge that was like a photocopy scan that was deliberately made to look pretty bad, just to see if they caught us. The other person didn't have anything at all. Not once did any of the security folks or the security guards stop us. One time we were actually trying to get into we were in HR, one of our objectives was to get the HR records, and we found the VP of HR's office, and, using our under the door tool, making a lot of noise to try to get in. And I turn around, and there's a woman sitting at her desk right there. And we get up, we're like, okay, that's not going to work, and we walked away. She didn't say anything. Nothing. So we kind of pushed the limits there, but no one said a thing. And their policy, written out, was to have your badge visible at all times with photo ID on it. Even the security guards didn't even ask us anything. Another event was, this is kind of fun. I did another red team where this is probably the easiest domain admin I've ever gotten. But I did some background research, found out that they were using an IT company for some of their IT stuff. And I called in and I said, hey, I'm from such and such IT company. I just want to verify a few things about the account. I think I talked to their secretary, and she said, okay, let me just pass you through to the relevant parties. So she passes us through. So of course, now my phone call looks like it's coming from internal to the organization, right, on the phone ID. But I get a hold of their internal IT people, and I talked to them, and I said, hey, I'm from such and such IT company. I'm looking to, I noticed that we need to make some changes to the account. I just need to verify, before we proceed, verify who you are, that you have permission to be able to make changes to this account. So what's your domain password? And I kid you not, they just gave me the domain password. And I even asked them to spell out, like, phonetically what it was. Oh, can you repeat that? And what was the phonetic code for it? Oh, yeah, it's this, such and such and such. And then we carried on the conversation, and that was that. So I literally got domain admin through a phone call. So if this person had known one of the key rules that I've discussed, you will never be solicited for your password, that would have never happened. And I probably would have been caught. So in both cases, if someone had known A, the policy, and B, some of the basics of security practices, and they cared about it, then the entire operation would have been shut down, would have been burned. That's it. So simple things. Those are simple things that easily could have stopped, way more damage further down the line. There was an instance of really good training where we were at we were on site of this building, and they had. So we were there during the day, and we'd already done quite a bit, and so we were trying to be a little more brazen with what we were doing. And so we were going to around the side entrances, and there was one where there's this big, long window, and there's a door in the middle of this like platform. So it's like completely open courtyard. I just walk up, and I see, oh, I can't get in. There's people there standing. And I kind of knock on the window. I'm like, hey, can you let me in? And they're like, they came into the door, opened the door, and they asked me for my badge. I said, oh, I don't have it with me. I'm just here to meet someone. I can't find my way in. They're like, okay, that's fine. Come on in. And I'm like, oh, sweet, I'm in. But then, because I didn't have my ID, they said, okay, I'm just going to have to escort you to security just to make sure that, so you can get your ID checked and just, everything's good. And so this person actually took me, walked me through the entire building. This is not a small building. They walked me through the entire building, and meanwhile, I'm like sweating and making up the story in my head about how I'm going to get out of this. And they bring me to the front desk of security. They say, here you go. This person needs help with their ID. I managed to find some excuse and way out of it, but regardless, they had caught me because they followed the policy. And I later found out that this person wasn't even in security. This person had nothing to do with security. They were a project manager in the organization. So this is someone that would fall under the general staff category, and they potentially just could have stopped a huge amount of damage to their organization. They probably did, just from that one thing, because it was okay, and they felt like it was a part of the culture to be able to do that. So that was a really good instance of just the human being your strongest advocate and being your strongest asset in security, just from that one little thing. So I thought that was really, really well done, and I ended up commenting to I hope they got a raise or something after that, but I commented to their bosses about it as well. So finishing up, I think the one thing you should understand from this conversation is that with the right training, you can make your employees your greatest security asset. So that project manager at the end, they became a stronger security control than any blinky boxes they had in their server room. Just that one person. The more people that you can teach, and I'm going to kind of get to this in the final message, the biggest vulnerability in the organization is humans. But if you're going to remember one thing about this entire presentation, remember this. The reason why it's important to teach them is because if you make them a part of your security team. So by sparking interest, and I want you to remember this, is when you're trying to teach security or when you're bringing someone in to teach security, the most important thing, the number one thing you should be trying to do is to spark an interest in security. Make them care about security. Make them want to learn on their own. If you can do that, then you have then grown your security team by 1 for every person you've done that to. And that person will then become a huge security asset. Huge. More than you can measure. And a close second is the material, which I hope that I've kind of covered some of the basics around throughout this presentation. So remember, spark that passion, spark that interest that we all have in security, and you know that it will grow on its own, and your organization, your company will be immensely effective, way more effective than you ever thought it could have been, because you brought them onto your team. So with that, I want to say thank you very much. I wanted to remind you I work for Security Compass. They've paid to bring me here, and thanks to them, I've learned a lot about this. So if you have any questions about anything, I think we have about 4 minutes here we can cover. But I want to remind before anyone leaves that these slides I will be posting online, so you can reference it later on, so you don't have to worry about taking notes or anything like that. Just follow me on Twitter, and I'll announce it on there, and it should be a lot easier. So is there any questions that I can address right now while we have the next 4 minutes? Any questions about the content we've covered, or best practices, or teaching experience, or heck, I'd even answer questions about red team stuff. Anyone? Yes. Sure. Mm-hmm. Right. So the question was, when you're doing a phishing emails, what kind of data do you track? Do you track individuals, or do you track just data around the number of clicks? It depends. When you're doing these kind of audits, you want to minimize the amount of individual blame that gets put on there. However, sometimes it's unavoidable. So it depends what your objective is. If your objective is to find how many people are going to enter a password, oftentimes you will then collect the numbers around how many people went to the site and entered data. Or you can do something, and this is usually the easiest way to do it, is just track how many people actually clicked a link to go to a malicious site. Because just clicking a link could lead you somewhere that does a drive-by download or executes a cross-site scripting attack or something. Clicking a link in itself could be lead to a bad outcome. So tracking either is good. It just depends on what the outcome is that you want. If you're earlier on in your security posture, it's probably going to be most effective to look at track the link clicking. But if you're later on, you've already maybe done it a few times, and you feel like you're a little more secure, you want to find out how many people are actually entering passwords, which could be potentially a whole lot more damaging. So it depends on what your outcome is. Does that make sense? Yes. How do you red team your users? Can you be more specific what you mean? What I meant by red teaming is more just a general red team practice. So I mean real red team. I don't necessarily mean doing a phishing campaign on its own or a pen test. I mean doing a whole red team engagement where there's no rules and you have objectives that you want to try to reach. So let's say, and this is why I've said the caveat before of you make sure that your security level is at a certain baseline where you have the basics covered, because otherwise it's going to be ineffective. But if you have those basics covered, and then you want to test to see overall how effective, how well your company is implementing security, so whether that's the developers that you're training on the internal applications, the sysadmins, how they're managing the network, how they're managing the systems, you can really audit everything together with a red team because it's a much more all-encompassing, thorough assessment. That's kind of what I meant. I didn't mean like individuals, red teaming individuals. It's more an organizational-wide thing, because the goal of this training is to improve the security of your organization, not just the individuals, but throughout the whole thing. Does that answer your question? Sure, that's a big component of it. Yeah, so that's red team usually consists of physical, which is like gaining access without a badge, or picking locks. Social engineering, which is just finding a way in or tricking people to give you passwords. And then there's the technical side of things where you're actually in the network or you're from the outside trying to break in. Those are kind of the three main components when it comes to a red team. Are there any other questions? No? If you have any other questions, I'm here for the rest of the day, and I'd be happy to answer them. You can reach out to me on Twitter anytime. My DMs are open. That hasn't blown up in my face yet. But if you want to ask me any questions anytime, please reach out. Thank you very much.